What happens when a single voice dares to challenge the system? What if that voice isn't silenced, but instead ignites a movement? Nigeria has seen its fair share of protests. The streets have echoed with chants, placards raised high, and frustration spilling over like an untamed river. But this time, it's different. The dissent isn't just in the streets. It's on phone screens, in living rooms, in whispered conversations between friends. It started with one voice, one seemingly ordinary voice. A young woman in a simple uniform sitting before a camera, unfiltered, unscripted, and fed up. She didn't march, she didn't call for a rally, she just spoke, and that was enough to shake the system.
I genuinely feel so overwhelmed, and I feel like if a lot of Nigerians come out and start speaking on what we are actually going through, then maybe changes will be made in the government. Don't you guys think? And this video, I just want to say to our president, I don't know if there have been any other president that is terrible, but you are such a terrible president.
What she said next would spark a nationwide conversation, divide opinions, and set in motion a wave of digital rebellion. But was it just an impulsive outburst? Or was it the first crack in a dam that was bound to break? Let's find out. It all started with a moment, a single frame. A woman in a simple NYSC uniform, staring into the camera, her voice steady but laced with frustration. Her name? Ushirita Ugwamayi. At first, it seemed like just another online rant, one of thousands floating through Nigeria's restless digital space. But as the words tumbled out, it became clear. This wasn't just another complaint. This was a breaking point. President Tinubu is a terrible leader. She said it plainly. No hesitation, no sugarcoating. Just a raw, unapologetic statement that resonated with millions of Nigerians struggling to stay afloat in an economy that seemed to be working against them. Then she went further. She called Lagos a smelling state. It was the kind of comment that could either be brushed aside or explode into something much bigger. It exploded. Within hours, the video spread across social media like wildfire. Twitter, Instagram, WhatsApp, every platform became a battleground of opinions. Some defended her, praising her courage for saying what many were too afraid to say. Others attacked her, claiming she had crossed the line. But there was no denying the reaction. People weren't just watching. They were feeling it. Because for many, this wasn't just about one woman's words. It was about a shared reality. To understand why a single video could trigger such an intense response, you have to understand the Nigeria it was born in. For months, frustrations had been boiling beneath the surface. Inflation had reached unbearable levels, food prices were soaring, and job opportunities were slipping away like sand through clenched fingers. The average Nigerian was exhausted from waking up each day to the same struggles, exhausted from leaders who promised change but delivered nothing, and most importantly, exhausted from being ignored. So when Ugwamai spoke, she wasn't just speaking for herself. She was giving voice to an entire generation that had been pushed to its limits. Her words weren't just heard, they felt, and pressure came swiftly. Authorities within the National Youth Service Corps (NYSC) were not pleased. Calls for disciplinary action were circulated. The backlash from government supporters grew louder. Then came the apology. In a formal statement, Ugwamaye took back her words, specifically the part about Lagos. She expressed regret for offending Lagosians, insisting she never meant to disrespect the state. But if the government thought an apology would calm things down, they miscalculated. Instead of dying down, the outrage only intensified. People weren't just angry at the economic conditions anymore. They were now questioning whether she had been forced to retract her words. Was she threatened, pressured, silenced? Speculation ran wild. And with each new rumor, public distrust deepened. It was no longer about her words alone. It was about the system that seemed desperate to shut her down. This is where the story takes a turn. What was supposed to be an isolated moment, a single rant in a sea of online noise, became something unstoppable. People began recording themselves, venting their frustrations about everything from inflation to corruption. Each video carried the same underlying message. If she can say it, so can we. A challenge unlike any other. No dance routines, no comedic skits, No lighthearted fun, just pure, unfiltered frustration. And unlike most social media trends that come and go in a matter of days, this one had staying power. Because for the first time in a long time, Nigerians weren't just complaining privately to friends and family. They were speaking out, together, in public.
We've lived in a country like animals. We've been so caged that we tend to forget that our leaders are accountable to us. We are not accountable to them. What do you mean by I criticize your government? And suddenly you are calling my line. Why are you calling my line? Go and do your work. If you were doing your work, would I be criticizing your government? Nigeria is a very crazy place. So a few days ago, you guys were arguing why 24 hours electricity is not good. Can you guys even hear yourselves?
Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. This was more than a viral challenge. It was a shift. For years, Nigerians had protested in traditional ways, marching, holding rallies, demanding change in the streets. But these protests were often met with force, crushed before they could gain real momentum. This was different. No one needed a permit to post a video. No one could physically stop someone from picking up their phone and pressing the record. There were no leaders to arrest, no crowds to disperse. It was decentralized defiance, a movement where every single person had the power to contribute. And the more people participated, the harder it became to ignore. A single rant had evolved into something far bigger, and as the challenge gained traction, the government took notice. Would they respond? Or would they attempt to suppress the voices growing louder by the day? One thing was clear, this wasn't going away anytime soon. But this movement didn't exist in a vacuum. It collided head-on with a country already teetering on the edge. Because while Nigerians were ranting, something even bigger was happening. A state of emergency, rising tensions, a leader under fire. As the country stood at a crossroads, one question remained. Would this challenge be the push that finally forced the government to act? If there was one thing Nigerian authorities had learned from the past, it was that social media could not be ignored. They had seen it before. The End SARS protests of 2020 began as an online outcry against police brutality. But as the movement grew, it spilled into the streets, culminating in one of the most defining protests in the country's history. The government had responded with force, eventually cutting off bank accounts, targeting protest organizers, and even resorting to military intervention. The scars of that crackdown still lingered. So when the 30-day rant challenge began gaining traction, the Nigerian government found itself in a difficult position. A forceful crackdown, like what happened with End SARS, would only fuel the flames of resistance, but ignoring it, that was equally dangerous. This wasn't just a passing trend, it was a pressure cooker, building towards an inevitable explosion. And this time, the grievances were not just about police brutality. They extended to the very core of survival itself. Unlike organized protests, which required planning, logistics, and a designated protest ground, the 30-day rant challenge was unpredictable. It didn't have a start time or an end time. There was no gathering to break apart, no single location to police. A protest could begin at any moment. A video recorded in a cramped apartment in Ibadan, a street corner in Abuja, or a roadside stall in Kano. One person's pain echoed into another, and the more the government tried to ignore it, the more powerful it became. Influencers, celebrities, and even ordinary Nigerians who had never been politically vocal started engaging with the challenge. Soon it became impossible to scroll through social media without seeing another testimony, another story of struggle. The Nigerian government, which had always relied on its ability to control the narrative, found itself losing grip over public opinion. Because this time, Nigerians weren't just watching the news. They were the news. The most terrifying thing for the Nigerian government, this wasn't just a Nigerian problem anymore. As videos continued to spread, the international community began to take notice. Diaspora Nigerians, living in the UK, the US, Canada, and beyond, began amplifying the challenge. Their voices carried weight in global media spaces, drawing attention to Nigeria's economic collapse in ways the government could not control. Foreign news outlets started covering the movement. Activists outside Nigeria joined in, urging their governments to scrutinize how foreign loans, trade deals, and diplomatic relations were helping sustain the economic conditions that had sparked this crisis. What began as a social media protest in Nigeria was now becoming a global conversation. And with that, the challenge had outgrown even the government's worst fears. At first, officials had dismissed the challenge as a trend that will fade away. But trends die when people lose interest. And this wasn't about interest. This was about survival. And so, as government silence turned into discomfort, and discomfort turned into quiet panic, one question loomed over the administration. Would they finally listen? Or would they make the same mistake they made before, underestimating the power of a generation that refuses to be silent? If history has taught us anything, it's this. When the people start speaking and no one listens, they will make you listen. But this challenge didn't just reveal public frustration, it also exposed something even bigger. While Nigerians were ranting about their struggles, another crisis was unfolding, one that had nothing to do with social media and everything to do with the government's grip on power. A state of emergency, a leader losing control. And the looming question, was Nigeria on the brink of something much bigger? For a government already struggling to contain a restless population, the 30-day rant challenge was more than just a viral trend. It was a symptom of a much deeper crisis, a crisis that was no longer confined to social media. Because while Nigerians were expressing their frustrations online, something far more immediate and dangerous was happening on the ground, a state of emergency, the very thing that signals a government has lost control. And when a government starts to lose control, it doesn't just fight the people, it fights itself. While the rants grew louder, President Bola Tinubu was busy dealing with another fire, this one burning in Rivers State, in what should have been one of Nigeria's wealthiest regions, thanks to its oil reserves. The state was descending into chaos. Pipeline vandalism, protests, a government scrambling to hold it all together. In March 2025, Tinubu declared a state of emergency in Rivers State, citing worsening unrest and economic sabotage. At first glance, it seemed like a local crisis, something that only affected the oil-producing region. But to those watching closely, it was much more than that. It was a warning sign. Because instability, once it starts, doesn't just stay in one place, it spreads. And when you look at the bigger picture, at the protests, the economic collapse, the growing anger, it becomes clear. This isn't just a Rivers State problem. It's a Nigeria problem. But here's where things took an even darker turn. The Rivers State emergency wasn't just about protests. It was also about a deepening power struggle between factions within the Nigerian government itself. The state's governor, Siminalayi Fubara, was already locked in a bitter political battle with his predecessor, Nyesom Wike, who had now become a top minister in Tinubu's administration. This wasn't just a disagreement. It was an all-out war for control. For weeks, tensions had been building between rival camps, so much so that it became hard to tell whether the real crisis in Rivers was caused by outside forces or the government itself. So when Tinubu declared a state of emergency, many questioned whether it was really about security, or if it was a convenient excuse to crush political opposition in a critical region. The timing was too perfect. With nationwide frustrations at an all-time high, an economic crisis spiraling out of control, and the 30-day rant challenge exposing just how angry Nigerians were, the last thing Tinubu could afford was losing control of Rivers State. Because here's the reality. If a key oil-producing region slips from his grip, it's not just about losing territory, it's about losing money. And when the money stops flowing, the entire system starts to crumble. Tinubu's state of emergency wasn't just a reaction, it was a sign of desperation. A government that is secure in its power doesn't need to declare states of emergency. A government that is confident in its control doesn't need to silence dissent. And yet, here was a president, barely a year into his term, already resorting to emergency measures. The cracks in the system were widening, and with every passing day, it became harder to ignore the domino effect unfolding across the country. Inflation cripples the economy, unrest spreading beyond Rivers State, a government divided against itself. A nationwide movement of discontent grew louder. Each of these was dangerous on its own, but together, They created the perfect storm. A storm that not even the government seemed prepared for. A government that was trying to contain multiple crises at once. Rivers State was just the most immediate threat. The real danger was what came next. Because if protests continued, if the economic situation worsened, if the 30-day Rant challenge turned into something even bigger, Tinubu's government might not survive it. And in a country where past administrations had fallen under similar pressure, this wasn't just speculation, it was a real possibility. This is no longer about whether things will get worse. It's about how much worse they'll get before something finally breaks. The state of emergency in Rivers State may have been the first official acknowledgement that Nigeria was in crisis, but it won't be the last. When a government is forced to declare emergencies just to maintain order, it's only a matter of time before the entire system starts to shake. And as the country teeters on the edge, one thing becomes clear. The next few weeks could determine the future of Nigeria. But while the government was trying to contain one crisis, another was quietly growing. Because if there was one thing the 30-day Rant challenge had proven, it was this. The people were no longer afraid to speak. And when a government is losing control, nothing is more dangerous than a population that refuses to be silenced. So what happens when frustration turns into defiance? What happens when a movement no longer asks for change, but demands it? The answer to that question is coming. And for those in power, it might be the answer they fear most. Now the question is, what happens next? A nation doesn't just wake up one day and decide to change. It doesn't happen overnight. It happens in phases. First, there is discontent, a quiet unease, a feeling that things aren't right but people keep pushing through, hoping for better. Then, there is frustration, a boiling point, when the weight of daily struggles becomes unbearable and people start speaking out, demanding answers. After that comes defiance, when speaking is no longer enough, when people stop waiting for change and start forcing it. And finally, there is action. This is the phase that Nigeria is now stepping into. Because no matter which way you look at it, one thing is clear. The country has arrived at a crossroads, and there are only two directions left to take. One leads to reform, a path where the government finally listens, finally addresses the demands of the people, and finally makes the changes that Nigeria so desperately needs. The other leads to chaos, a future where the people, tired of waiting, take matters into their own hands, dismantling the system that has failed them. Which road Nigeria takes next depends on what happens now. And as the days pass, the question isn't just whether the government will act. The real question is it already too late? History has a pattern. It whispers its warnings long before a country falls into revolution or collapse. And if Nigeria's leaders were paying attention, they'd realize that the warning signs are already blinking red. Because when a country reaches a certain level of economic and social instability, events tend to spiral quickly. First, the people lose faith in their leaders. Then, they lose faith in the system. And finally, they lose patience. Nigeria is already deep into the second phase. The people aren't just angry at President Tinubu. They're angry at the entire system, at the unchecked corruption, in the broken economy. Decade after decade, the only thing that changes is the name of the man in charge, while life for the average Nigerian stays the same. And once people stop believing that change can come from the system, they stop following the rules of that system. They create their own rules. They find new ways to survive. And when that happens, societies don't just slip into chaos, they crash. Right now, Tinubu's administration is running out of options. The 30-day Rant challenge is no longer just a protest. It's a national thermometer, measuring the level of public frustration, and that thermometer is boiling. Meanwhile, the state of emergency in Rivers State proves that the government is already struggling to maintain basic control. It's not just the economy that is failing. The entire system of governance is weakening. Each decision the government makes now is being watched, scrutinized, judged by a population that has lost its trust in leadership. But will Nigeria do something to convince locals? Or will they keep putting pressure to silence them? Let us know in the comment section. Do you think they can silence a whole nation? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.